It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deborah Savage. She is a member of the faculty at the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity at the University of St. Thomas, where she teaches philosophy and theology and also serves as the director of the Masters in Pastoral Ministry program. She is the co-founder of the Siena Symposium, an interdisciplinary think tank at the University of St. Thomas, organized to respond to Pope John Paul II's call for a new and explicitly Christian feminism. Tonight she shares a topic closely linked to the Lenten season, the Eucharist and the work of human hands. Please welcome Dr. Savage.
Okay, so the first question is going to be, can you hear me? All right. If anybody has any trouble, just go like this, because sometimes I fade in and out. It's a bad habit I have. And I also want to start by saying, obviously I'm just so honored to have been invited by Father Humberto and the staff at St. Mark's. I was telling my husband Andrew tonight before I left that because, I mean, it's the end of a very long week. And I said, but I would do anything for Father Humberto, and that's a fact. I think you're very lucky to have that priest and the brothers here and everything, don't you think? I think they're fabulous. Yeah. The other thing I want to say is I'm intimidated because there's several of my colleagues here from St. Thomas. Now, usually you can get away with anything at these, nobody really knows you in a way, and no one will hear anything afterwards, but now, I don't know, there's philosophers here and theologians and stuff, and they're all looking at me like, I've seen how you operate. So I am honored to have been asked here, especially to have been given a chance to reflect with you on the Eucharist and the work of human hands. It's a topic very near and dear to my heart for reasons that will become clear. The title you may have recognized already. Oh my gosh, here's some more people. Someone in a habit, a nun. A couple of them potentially. That's what I mean. This place is like blessed, it really is. You may recognize the phrase, the work of human hands, is a reference to a moment during the Mass when the priest prepares the gifts to be offered as a sacrifice on the altar. And so this is the connection I'm going to be trying to make between our work and that moment in the Mass, okay? And I should also warn you that I usually do this as a day-long retreat, and I do this in 2 separate sessions, both of them an hour long. So I'll do my best to pack it all in. I may have to talk kind of fast, so I'll do my best to be comprehensible, though. That would be important. So one of the things in my sessions, like the longer sessions I generally begin with, is this question, and I want you to think about it. I'm not going to make you answer it like I would if we were in more of a retreat situation. Ask yourself this question: what is the relationship between my work and my salvation? That is, my hope and some share in eternal life with God. Does my work, in other words, hi Nora, she's my friend now because I get her breadsticks. Does my work, the specific contribution I make to the support of my family or my community, wherever that might be, does it have anything to do with my salvation? Does it matter? Does it matter how I make the beds, mow the lawn, complete a report, speak to a customer, cater a meal, deliver a talk? Does any of that have to do with my salvation, or is my work a separate realm, alienated or divorced from such considerations? Is it the case that I only work out my salvation at Sunday Mass, occasional or frequent confession, daily prayer? Think about that. Now, I ask this question because it reveals something we need to acknowledge, that there is often a bit of a gap between our faith lives and our lives in the so-called real world. Even those of us who are truly faithful and pray every day and we're at Mass every day and we go to confession as often as we can, etc., have even you, I'm not actually putting myself in that category. I strive for it, but I don't know if I'm there yet. Even you may have experienced this yourself, the syndrome of church on Sunday and work on Monday. And there's a giant existential divide between them. This is at least characteristic of our culture. Can we agree on that? Church on Sunday, work on Monday, and I'm living two lives. And so in a way, we are here to deal with this divide. Because of our fragmented culture and our fragmented selves, I suspect even those of us who completely and profoundly accept the omniscience of God, there is nowhere that God's reign does not hold, right? Even those of us who accept that can sometimes fall into the trap of the divided self. So we will try to sort that out in the course of these reflections. But I'm not going to start with theology. I finally figured that out, that it's much better to start with a story. And so that's what I'm going to do. Now, my husband and I will be married 26 years this April 1st. And yes, you don't have to applaud, but I feel like it myself. I can't do it. We went to Medjugorje for our honeymoon, and then my husband's from Slovenia, so then we traveled north to Slovenia to meet his relatives over there and be with them for several weeks. And in retrospect, I probably should have insisted on going to Hawaii, because mostly what we did is sit around and drink beer and eat sausage. Not the kind of thing you want to do when you're a new bride, but anyway. So what our task was to visit virtually every relative that the Persics have in Slovenia, and there were quite a few, and we were supposed to give money to them or greetings or whatever, you know how that might be. So one particularly remote relative we had to find, sort of shirt-tail relative, we finally found her at a church. Now this is a tiny little town, there's no street numbers, so you don't really, or address numbers or anything like that. We finally tracked her down by talking to people. I didn't understand a word, but they were talking to people, where's so-and-so, where's so-and-so. We finally found her at the church, and it was her job to take care of the altar and make sure that everything is ready for the priest for Mass and so on. Absolutely this most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I remember her face even today. I mean, physically attractive, surely, but what I noticed about her was she was sort of lit from inside. And she had the most peaceful, glowing countenance I had ever seen. I could not understand a word they said, but what I wanted was to stay with her. I really did. I wanted to stay with her. I wanted to be with her. Her presence was so enormously comforting. She just had this glow. Okay, so I took note of that. We traveled on. I was basically along for the ride for most of that trip. We ended up in a completely different town, a town named Bled, different relatives. I met so many. I must have met at least 100 relatives while I was there. I'm not exaggerating. And we were on a boat, and again, I can't understand a word. But there was a woman who was on the boat with us. We were on our way across this lake to a church that's a really old church in the middle of Lake Blade. It was really beautiful. And this older woman gets on the gondola with us, and she says to my husband Andrew in Slovenian, "Aren't you Andrew or Andrej Perčić?" And she recognized him, and they started to have this conversation. He hadn't seen her in decades, but somehow she recognized him. And I kept trying to place her. I kept thinking to myself, now where have I seen this woman before? And I've met so many relatives, I'm thinking I must have met her somewhere. So finally I said to Andrew, have we met this woman before? Where did we meet her? How come I know her? He said, no, you've never met her before. I haven't seen her in decades. I could barely remember her name when she sat down in the boat. She's really not a relative. She's just somebody who lives in Blake. And it suddenly hit me that what I recognized in her was the same look. that what I recognized was the countenance of Jesus. She was lit from within in the exact same way, and I spoke about this with a priest later, and that's what he told me, that I had recognized Jesus in them. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm trying to get across the actual vivid nature of this impression. I know I've seen her somewhere. Where have I seen her? She had the same look. I was absolutely stunned. It was as though for both these women, you could see directly into their being. So I asked this priest, a Slovenian priest who spoke English, thankfully, and he was the one who told me I had recognized Christ in them. But what he told me about were these women's lives during and after World War II. You don't know much about the history of Slovenia, I'm sure, but it's really a nightmare. Tito takes over. There's refugees. My husband, Andrew, was born in a refugee camp. It's quite a story. And he said these women had nothing but the Eucharist to sustain them. And the suffering that they went through was so profound. The only thing that would keep them alive in a real sense was their faith and their contact with the Eucharist. Now, I begin with this story in order first to ground our reflections on the meaning of the Eucharist in a human reality and possibility. The second person of the Trinity became man, became incarnate in order to save us and in order to live in us. Christ incarnate comes to us in the Eucharist in order to live in us, to transform us into himself, right? But even if I believe with all my heart in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, if it has no impact on my being, on my experience of my inner life, unless I touch almost organically the physical sense of Christ's presence within me, my belief in his presence remains at the level of thought. And Christ is not a thought. He is not a proposition. Those men that have taken philosophy from me, we go over that. Christ is not a proposition. To be a Christian cannot be reduced to believing more and more true propositions. The famous existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that ultimately to be a Christian is an experience of what he called an infinite passion for the truth. It is a relationship to the truth and to the central proposal of Christianity, eternal happiness. The Catechism says, at the heart of catechesis we find, in essence, a person. The person of Jesus of Nazareth, the only Son from the Father. And the whole effort of catechesis is to put people into communion with Christ. And Christ is a person. So to be a Christian on this account is to become Christ, or at least Christ-like, in a sense to accept him into myself, to be permeated and infused by him. As John the Baptist said, I must become less so that he can become more. Christ is a person. He became man that we might return to the Father in him, through him, and with him in the unity of the Holy Spirit. So these humble peasant women, through their daily reset, have no education really. They live on farms. They go to daily mass. That's the only thing they have really, in a way. Nothing like what we've got over here, in our wealth. But these humble peasant women, through their daily reception of the Eucharist and through their own sufferings and sacrifices which they offered up with, in, and through Christ in the sacrifice of the Mass, embodied the incarnate Christ in some small and very human way, which was visible to the naked eye. This is what I hope for someday. To communicate Christ to others without relying on words, through my very being. I want what those women had, because I could see Christ just breathing in their eyes. Yeah. If you want to be involved in the new evangelization, wouldn't that be a little easier? than trying to use so many words and make sure you get the catechism right and all that stuff. Just to be Christ in a certain sense, right? So I'm sure this is everyone's goal who's here. The question is how? So I can't say I've achieved that level of simplicity in myself, and my life simply does not seem designed for sainthood. I work, I clean house, I care for our daughter Maddie, I make dinner for my family, I do the usual stuff. I go to Mass in a good week, sometimes almost daily. I pray, I go to confession, I try to be nice to people. I give money here and there, sometimes more than I should, most often just enough to assuage my guilty conscience at having so much. But I do my best. Yet Jesus tells us that we are to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. And so the question is, if we want to be like those women, what means are available to us now here in St. Paul, Minnesota, at the beginning, more or less, of the 21st century, right? What means are available to me? And here we come to what I would argue, or what I hope you'll see as the first substantive point. Because in fact, though the form it takes is very different, the same means are available to me as were available to those women and to all people throughout the ages. I have to work. Even for those who don't work outside the home, thankfully you don't ask moms anymore if they work, because as you know, moms work. We ask them if they work outside the home. Even if it's work inside the home, it is still work. The social and historical context in which I work may be very different, obviously in some ways more comfortable and more profitable. But my claim here tonight will be that all work done within a horizon that includes the transcendent reality of God and my own hope in eternal life with Him, however obscurely felt at times, requires sacrifice and effort, if only I know how to look at it. And so, let us take a look then at our work in this new light. And we will do so with the help of St. John Paul II and his astonishing encyclical on human work. Anybody read it? Except for, okay, all right, yes. You guys over here, yes. I know that we probably don't think of work as a means of salvation, but I would posit this question. If our work has nothing to do with our salvation, we would really have to question what we are doing. Maybe there's people in this room, I don't know, I know some, who spend 50 to 70 hours a week doing something that has absolutely nothing to do with their real goal, with final communion. For those that don't work that many hours, like in a corporate environment, you know, why make the beds every day? Why mow the lawn? Why do we worry about our kids when they don't seem to like working, right? We'll see why those things are we're sort of called to those things. We understand something about work without having articulated it, and John Paul II does so in spades in his encyclical. So here's a quote from the last part of that encyclical in a section entitled A Spirituality of Work. And in a sense, this quote brings the entire document to its logical conclusion. So this is sort of toward the end. He says, these points need to be properly assimilated. An inner effort on the part of the human spirit, guided by faith, hope, and charity, is needed in order that through these points, the work of the individual human being may be given the meaning which it has in the eyes of God. And here's the salient point, by means of which work enters into the salvation process on a par with the other ordinary yet particularly important components of its texture. John Paul II is saying to us that our work enters into the salvation process on a par with the other components we all consider already a part of that. Does that surprise anybody? Okay. And he's a saint, so I think, there's something there. So what we have to do now is turn our attention to the task of understanding on what basis he makes this claim. And for help, we will turn first to Scripture. And so here is a sort of trick question. Pay attention. I'm going to ask you to answer. Not everybody all at once or anything. I'll pick somebody. At Genesis 1:28, Adam and Eve hear these words: "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." John Paul admits that the word work is not used in this paragraph, but argues that beyond any doubt, they indirectly indicate it as an activity for man to carry out in the world. So at 127, God says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." This is understood in the tradition as the call to work. Here's the trick question. And you guys over here, you don't get to answer. Does this call to work, does it come before or after the fall? Before. Very good. I guess I knew you guys would know. Some audiences go, I'm not sure. So what? So what? What does that mean? Work is not punishment for sin. That is correct. So we cannot think, first of all, the first part of the argument is you cannot think of work as punishment for sin, something that we have to do because we fell, and if only Adam and Eve hadn't eaten of the free tree of good and evil, or true and false, what do you mean, the tree of knowledge, we'd all be sitting around on lawn chairs drinking our favorite adult beverage. It looks like even in the garden, there's work to be done. Adam at 2:11 is put in the garden to till it, also before the fall. Okay. So John Paul II makes a lot of really profound points with this. We know from the theology of the body that at this point he would refer to them as being in the state of original innocence, and yet they're called to work. So what it means then is that, as we've said, work cannot be seen then as a punishment for sin, though once the fall occurs, of course, Adam and Eve learn that it will become more burdensome because of it. Both will have to struggle with creation now rather than live in peaceful, painful harmony with it. But if Scripture is to be believed, we can most certainly say that since the call to work comes before the fall, we can understand it as a natural part of our human condition. In fact, John Paul tells us that the only conclusion we can draw from this account is that work is, in fact, a fundamental dimension of human existence. It is an integral part of the mystery of creation itself. This is why, parents, you know that if your children don't learn how to work, they will not be happy. That's right. They will not be happy. And there's a lot more to that than we have time for. But every time a child learns a new task, or I remember the first thing Maddie learned how to do was empty the knife and fork tray. She had no idea what it even meant. But John Paul II would say that is an act of self-transcendence. Every time you learn something new, it's an act of self-transcendence. You're engaged in an act of self-transcendence now. Right? Because there's, I'm hoping anyway, some ideas here you haven't heard before. If not, you can quietly leave if you wish. I mean, I won't take it personally. But this was news to me when I read all this. So he goes on to say that we are called to work because we are made in the image of God who creates, and it is in working that we reflect that image and participate in the ongoing process of creation. In fact, work is one of the characteristics, he says, that distinguish the human person from the rest of creation. Bees are busy, but you can't really say what they're doing is working. Not in the same way that a human being does. We choose to hit the snooze button or not, right? We choose when we're going to finally make the beds, just before the kids get home or whatever. I'm not speaking from personal experience there, but. Okay. He says, it is through work that our lives are sustained, communities are built, and our nature is realized. He states only man is capable of work, and only man works at the same time by work, occupying his existence on earth. Thus, work bears a particular mark of man and of humanity, the mark of a person operating within a community of persons. So other people have written about this, Dorothy Sayers for one thing, as an example. But it definitely can be argued that John Paul II is the first and only to spell out its implications fully. Because he makes an additional, arguably radical claim in the encyclical, he states that work is the key, maybe the essential key, to the social question. So the social question, this is a social encyclical. Since the Industrial Revolution, all the popes have written about this. It has to do with how do we live in peace secured by justice. It's been a question since the beginning of time. And John Paul II is saying that the key to the social question, which is a real question for a lot of people on this planet right now, the key is the meaning of work. That's a pretty big claim. Yeah. So we won't have time to fully penetrate the meaning of that claim, but it has to do with the anthropological significance he attributes to human action in the world. It has to do with his idea of what it means to be an acting person. And here's what I can tell you as a quote. I have actually used this with Maddie. Maybe parents, you should write this down. He says that, for one thing, work itself is an expressly human act, and that through our work we become who we're meant to be or not. And we're going to explore that a little further. But the fundamental premise is this. He says each person, every man, is a subjective being, capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about himself, with a tendency toward self-realization. So I'm going to say that again in a second, but I have to tell you why. Because Maddie will say to me, why do I have to clean my room? She doesn't ask that anymore because for several years the answer I gave was, because you're a subjective being. Capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about yourself with a tendency toward self-realization. You run into her anywhere and ask her about that and she'll repeat it for you. But you know what? She's 12 now, and now she's starting to get it. She'll say, oh, I see, this is why I have to do this. Because what did you say that again? Say that again, Mom. Yeah. I'm a subjective being capable of deciding about myself with a tendency toward self-realization. I'm on the move. And I move through life learning how to work, how to be responsible for myself so that I can at some point be responsible for others. Okay. So the argument he makes begins with a fundamental distinction between the two dimensions of human work. The first is the objective dimension. This is the thing we usually associate with work. It's the results from work in the external or material sense, either a product or a service, whether in the public or the private sphere. This is the dimension we most associate with working. It's what the customer buys. It's what we may or may not get paid to produce. It's the pizza or the lecture we deliver. It's the meal our family eats. It's the reasonably clean house. The second and more important dimension is the subjective dimension, and it's the primary concern of the encyclical. This refers to the person performing the work, that is, the subject of work, who by virtue of his or her own humanity is called to be a person in the fullest sense of that word. He says the human person made in the image of God reflects God's creative activity in the act of working, and here's that quote, and is a person, that is to say, I'm not going to say it again, a subjective, come on, let's hear it, a subjective being, capable of acting in a planned and rational way. Brother, Deacon, you know this. Capable of deciding about himself with a tendency to self-realization. So this is why you insist that your children work, because you know They need to realize something that is merely potency right now. It's not punishment. You're not making them clean up your, I mean, the honest thing is it would take me a lot less time to clean out the dishwasher than it takes Maddie to do it, but I want her to do it. Why? Because I know this. Because you know this. That's right. So the subjective dimension of human work is constituted by the fact that in working, the person not only creates some object, but also creates herself in the process. The Holy Father states work is not only good in the sense that it is useful or something to enjoy, it is also good as being something worthy. That is to say, something that corresponds to man's dignity, that expresses this dignity and increases it. If one wishes to define more clearly the ethical meaning of work, it is this truth that one must particularly keep in mind. Work is a good thing for man, a good thing for his humanity, because, he says, through it, he transforms not only nature, but also achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more of a human being. So, John Paul II says, we become who we are through the work that we do, and the actions we take in that regard must serve to realize our humanity, to fulfill the calling to be a person that is ours by reason of our very humanity. And he says that the value of work is not a function of the kind of work being done, but is to be attributed to the fact that the one doing it is a person. The value of work is not found in the value of the widget I produce or how well I play basketball or any of that stuff. This is how we honor work in our culture, right? The basketball players get all the money and the philosophy professors at the universities get next to nothing. No, the value of work is found in the fact that the one doing it is a person. Now, in the natural law tradition, there's a recognition that we are already in debt to our Creator for the gift of life. We are born in debt. And we are obligated by that debt to become the person He had in mind when He created us. And St. John Paul II is telling us here that this takes place in part through work. And for me, this is the foundation of the Church's whole entire social tradition. Because if this means that somewhere in the world, and we know this is true, there are structures preventing people from finding meaningful work that allows them to put food on the table for their families and create a life that has meaning for them, that it's not just an economic problem. We're actually participating in the structures of sin that make it impossible for these people to repay their debt to their Creator. That's the linchpin of the Church's social tradition right there. That's why work is the key to the social question. Because it's through my work that I become who I'm meant to be. Now, I'm not trying to divorce work from prayer. We're going to come back to that in a second. But just understand the meaning of work in that way right now. It starts to matter a lot how well you do your job, because how well you do your job will determine the kind of person that you become. Right? If I do a sloppy job making the beds in the morning, some days are better than others, but I try to do it with love every morning. If Maddie does a sloppy job on her homework, she's going to become what? A sloppy student, a sloppy person. Right? If I don't prepare well for class, then I become a sloppy teacher. These are sort of coarse examples, but this is just the reality. Right? In the virtues tradition, it's easy to see. If I lie once, that's one thing, but if I lie continually, I become or I tell Maddie when we go to Cub, no, you can't steal candy from the bulk food section, because you'll become a thief eventually, even if you only just take one. She knows this, it's a law. You take something continually, even if it's just a little bit, eventually become a thief, right? So the same thing is true with regard to our work. We need to face it and do a job well done is a reflection of its author. Okay. So another implication of this, very briefly, is that if it is the subjective dimension of work that gives it its dignity, then we're obligated to question the bias that exists in our culture toward placing more importance on the objective value of work than on its subjective dimension. This insight should do away with the differentiation of people into classes according to the kind of work they do. The working men and women who service in restaurants or collect the garbage lend as much dignity to their work as those who occupy the more prestigious jobs in our community. Cleaning ladies and gardeners, childcare workers, and parking lot attendees possess as much dignity as those who hire them. I have heard it said that the most insidious ism in our culture is not racism or sexism, but classism, right? I used to work in the factory. That's how I put myself through college as an undergraduate. And I saw that firsthand, yeah. And yet some of the wisest people I've ever met, mostly women, were some of those women that I worked with on the factory floor. Real dignity. They had real dignity. But we were just factory workers. We didn't have brains, right? Yeah. That was a joke. Not a very good time. All right, don't quote me on that. Yeah, Dr. Savage said people that work at factories, they don't have. No, that's not what I meant. Okay. So it doesn't mean we cannot rate or quantify the value of work in its objective aspect, but it does mean that we must remember that the primary basis of the value of work is man himself, who is its subject. John Paul says that only when the goal of work is man himself, only when he is reflecting on his personhood as a conscious and free subject in making decisions about his work, can he be said to be master of it. It is only in this context that the biblical meaning of work is fulfilled, when throughout the process man manifests himself and confirms himself as the one who dominates. Okay. And so, that's probably enough on that. Maybe a little more than you wanted, but I kind of had to get it all out, okay? And so now we're ready to consider more fully the intersection between our work and the Eucharist, which is what you probably came for. So you may have already considered, or even deeply considered, the words the priest says during the offertory. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, right? Through your goodness we have this bread to offer, which earth has given and human hands have made. It will become for us the bread of life. This prayer, I'd say, reveals a profound truth, that it is at the sacrifice on the altar where we join our work to the sacrifice of Christ and participate in the redemption of the world. Now, a little historical perspective on this should clarify. In the Middle Ages, pretty much everybody in the town was Catholic. And I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, what did they do about making sure everybody got communion? I mean, this was well before the days when you could go down to St. Patrick's Guild and buy those little boxes of wafers and stuff. Or the bottles of wine, right? You couldn't go to Surdyk's or wherever you go, I guess St. Thomas Liquor, and buy a bottle of red wine. Okay. So how did they handle that? Well, everybody in the town before Mass began would bring their bread and their wine to a little window at the back. And that is those were the bread and the wine that were used during the sacrifice. What was that? The result of their work. Now, in our situation, the meaning of that ritual is a bit obscured. I go to a church, not St. Mark's, I'm not sure how you do it here, but instead of bringing the collection up at the same time as the gifts, an usher scurries surreptitiously up the side aisle to hand it off, somewhat ironically, to the closest Eucharistic minister, who unobtrusively hands it off to someone in the sacristy. I don't mean to be critical. It seems to me this practice has allowed our awareness of the relationship between the Eucharist and our own work to sort of dim. Because it is in the Eucharist that our work is offered to God. Those are the gifts that are consecrated and offered to God. They become the body and blood of Christ. So it is our work that joins with Christ's sacrifice and is offered to the Father. We bring the fruits of our labor, in our case now our monetary contribution. This would be what John Paul would call the objective dimension of human work. But that is what is added to the gifts that are offered at the altar. That makes some sense, right? But what is less visible and more important is this, because there is a prior reality to consider. After all, it is via the subjective dimension of work that the objective results of work are created. The value of work is found in the fact that the one doing it is a person. And though it is true that in working I create things that can quite legitimately be traded and contributed and shared, in that process I also, in a sense, create myself. And it is this inner work more than anything, it is my being, my effort to become what God wants me to be during this past week that is offered. It's really my work on myself. Yeah, the visible sign is I write a check and I put it in the envelope. But really, work isn't just about having a commodity to share. In John Paul's account, work is the means by which I become who God had in mind when he created me. It's one of the ways, anyway, I repay the debt of the gift for the gift of life. And so the real thing that's offered on the altar at that point in the consecration is me, my sacrifice, my suffering, my willingness to give of myself to my family, to my workplace, to my community. Do you see what I mean? Right? Am I on the right track, do you think? Yeah, it's not just stuff, in other words. It's me becoming who I'm meant to be, what I am in potency mostly, even right now. So here I say, what could be more clear? This work is not just the money we make nor the objects we produce. What we learn from John Paul II is that it is ourselves, our becoming, our own joining of ourselves to Christ on the cross through the work that we do. But what is our work? Merely a means to make money, a job, a chance to excel, to be famous, to have a career? Or do we see it as a vocation, a place where we can put our gifts to work in the service of the kingdom? A place where the call to holiness is sounded. Here's sort of the punchline. The call to holiness is sounded every day, not just in a concern for ethical business practices, but every moment of the day. Do we remember that we are always in the presence of God? Do we attend to his presence in the everyday occurrences? Do we notice the opportunity for small or big sacrifices? Let me remind you, what I'm trying to do is become like those women. And everyone here knows the kind of work it takes to do a good job. It's hard. Some days it's easier just to, kind of make do, right? Yeah, we all know that. But the kind of sacrifice it calls for, John Paul in this encyclical points out that these are the moments of everybody's day where they are called to join with Christ on the cross, to make that type of sacrifice. It's not just giving my money away to the poor. That's important too. But what is there in my life that calls me to make that kind of sacrifice? Here's some examples. The coworker who needs help. The coworker we can barely abide. The successful colleague who, though we hate to admit it, we envy for their accomplishments. The temptations to gossip and speak ill of others and the pleasure we get from that. The customer who asks us to go the extra mile. The child who never seems to finish their homework unless it's, after 9 o'clock at night, right? The husband who needs us to keep a commitment to them, even if it means saying no to an opportunity for glory or appearing really committed at work. Here's my personal favorite. Waiting that extra split second to allow actual grace to keep me from reacting angrily to something my husband just said, right? All these little things, they kind of add up, right? They'll make my approach to that, my attitude in the face of that call to sacrifice is what will add up to perhaps a transformation in myself and the thing that I offer at the Eucharist. That's what I offer. What I realized lately is that I don't really know how to suffer. I don't want to suffer. And I will never be able to join my suffering to Christ if I don't find a way to simply wait 10 seconds before I give in to my negative reactions. I must be the only one. Nobody's nodding. Sister, you're not nodding that, I expect. But my husband says something absolutely unintentionally that sets me off, and I cut him exactly 0 slack. My boss brags one more time about that award he got or the paper he's publishing, and I harbor resentment toward him all day, trying to justify it by criticizing him for his boastfulness and feeling sorry for myself because I deserve more credit for my work when I really don't. The examples can be multiplied indefinitely. Those are the negative examples, but there's good ones too. The days I stay late to finish a project that my team is counting on me to do, when I'd really rather go home and lay down and read a book or watch my favorite program on TV. The alarm goes off in the morning and I'm really tired, but I get up anyway because otherwise Maddie won't get to school on time. The moms here, you know about this. This is my work. This is what constitutes my life, for all these little moments where I'm called to do something, to be for others, right? And the point I'm trying to make is that if my goal, as we all agreed at the beginning, is to be someone in which others recognize Christ, all those moments are ordered toward that. Where else are, in the 21st century in America, when you can go to Lund's and buy a gallon of milk on your way home from work or wherever, where else are you going to get the opportunity for the kinds of sacrifices that those women made? It's got to be in our daily lives, in the work that we do, right? Nod your heads or something. The men in my class know, since I'm a girl, I'm looking for personal feedback. Okay. What else? Somebody...
The radiators from Praise God.
What's that?
The radiators are fine.
Oh, okay. Oh,
They were
okay. We could spend a long time on this topic, and we could talk about the virtues. I'm going to refer to them in a minute. But one of the things I'd like to point out, or maybe ask this question: who has virtue? Who comes to mind when you hear the question? Who would you think of as a virtuous person? Who has virtue that you know? Throw out some names.
My wife.
Your wife. Is she here? Good one. Okay. Parents. Okay, this is a very intelligent crowd. Most people say, well, John Paul II, Mother Teresa. And I always say, what about you? My father went to work every single day for 30 years. Never missed a day of work to put 6 kids through college or whatever, Actually, not me, but the rest. I was the oldest, so I was different. But what am I getting? If that isn't courage, I don't know what is. St. Augustine says courage is the capacity to endure for the sake of what is loved. Right? So the sort of where this cashes out is in a recognition that I practice the virtues in my everyday life, in my approach to the work I do for my families, for my company, wherever I am. There's work to do. And the question is, do I do it with everything I've got, with love, out of love for those I care about? Do I persevere for the sake of what is loved, or not? Right? So all these moments presented as ordinary and on the surface unimportant moments are actually opportunities for sacrifice, opportunities to join my suffering to that of Christ on the cross. My problem is I'm waiting for the big moment. I want to be a martyr or something. I think that would be a really easy ticket to heaven. Yeah, that's what. Yeah, it's not really actually very funny when you think about what's going on in the Middle East. Yeah. So it might have been funny one day, but it wasn't. It's not really funny today. But my ego blinds me to the small way spoken of by Saint Teresa of Lisieux. The little way of small things done with love. So these are the things that I bring to the Mass, that are incorporated into the symbol of the gifts brought to the altar. I join myself with those gifts in every small sacrifice I make throughout the week. If I have made no sacrifice, not just in giving up something, but in giving something of myself to my work, what do I bring to the celebration? Where am I then in the sacrifice of the Mass? You know, Vatican II said the lay people need to participate more in the Eucharist, and that turned into we're supposed to sing and stuff. You know, we can talk about that maybe after. In what sense do I participate in the sacrifice of the Mass? When I offer myself as immolation on the altar. When I join myself to Christ by engaging in these small acts of love and sacrifice throughout the week, that is what is offered on the altar from me. I don't make it holy. I'm not saying that. But I have to bring that. That's what I have to bring. That's participation. And I'm there and I'm saying, Christ, help me to be more. Help me to empty myself more. Help me to give more, right, to that moment in the Mass. I'm running out of time. So I want to just finish with Nora. Shh. Okay, Nora. Yay. You're sorry now, I know your name. I just want to point out a couple things that came along recently in the liturgy. When I was growing up, we said this, and now we're saying it again, which is that moment where everything seems to come together, where we say, now only say the word and my soul shall be healed. You know, some of you are too young to know that we actually used to say that, and now we say it again, and I'm so happy about that. We know where it's from. It's the words of the centurion. But why did we change that? We used to say, only say the word and I shall be healed. And now it's only say the word and my soul shall be healed. Why is that? Because it's the soul that makes me what I am. And when I say the word and I shall be healed, or my soul shall be healed, I'm asking that Christ, that through the Eucharist, Christ will speak his word in me. The Logos will sound in me. Every time, I'm not kidding, I think. I mean, there's some Sundays I suppose I forget or whatever. But for the most part, I love that moment because I think maybe today it'll finally spread, it'll reverberate, there'll be a vibration, and I will be healed. Right? That's what I hope for, is to be healed. So now this asking the Lord to simply say the word is not to be taken like some evangelical preacher shouting, heal, heal. No, for the word is Christ, the Logos. And the meaning of the phrase that I must have in mind when I say it for the prayer to resonate within me is really a profound and unfathomable mystery. So I can see I'm about to get the hook. So I'll just skip to the end. When we toil, whether it is to provide for our families, to become more a human being, or to pursue peace and justice and contribute to the conditions that foster human development, in that effort we find a small part of the cross of Christ. This is a quote from the encyclical. And the Christian will accept this in the same spirit of redemption in which Christ accepted his cross for us. To accept our cross at work and to suffer with Christ cannot be reduced to work seen as a kind of drudgery, for we have realized that work is a fundamental part of human existence. Human persons must make a sort of inner effort, not to be confused with any sort of Pelagian error, to recognize the meaning of our work and its potential to call us to new levels of self-transcendence. Conversion at work means that as I try to approach my work virtuously, as my intentions are more and more cleansed, I move from what is merely a potency to what is actual. My intellect seeks the truth more and more. My will is attracted more and more by the good the intellect reveals. I begin to see truly what is actually going on around me. To suffer for the truth and for the good it requires me to do. It means considering the fact that my work can serve what is beautiful and accepting the suffering that comes with the effort to do something well. So I guess I have to be done. But maybe I made my point. Okay. Thank you for your kind attention.